to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs. My name is Virginia Chung, and I co-chair the Social Impact Forum along with Ian McCaw, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. And we're here to enjoy a fireside chat about a book that's still hot off the press, Every Purchase Matters: How Fair Trade Farmers, Companies, and Consumers Are Changing the World, written by Paul Rice, the founder and former CEO of Fair Trade USA, the leading certifier of fair trade products in the United States. John Mackey, the co-founder and former CEO of Whole Foods, called Paul's book a phenomenal read with so many wonderful stories and lessons from the leader who built the fair trade movement. Whether you're a conscious capitalist or a concerned consumer, this book is a must read. As you might guess, Paul's background is awesome too. Since launching the Fair Trade Certified label in 1998, consumer recognition of the Fair Trade Certified label is now 65%, and U.S. retail sales of fair trade products have grown to $11 billion annually. Yes. As a result, Fair Trade USA and its market partners, everyone from Whole Foods to Walmart, have generated more than $1.3 billion in additional income for farmers and workers in 72 countries, allowing them to care for the environment and steadily improve their livelihoods. Paul's earned prestigious awards in recognition of his achievements. Paul's joined in conversation by Priya David Clements, who's known for leading discussions that go below and beyond the surface. With more than 15 years of television news experience, Priya has anchored and reported nationally for CBS, NBC, MSNBC, and locally for KTVU, KQED, KOIN, and WVTM. Her Bridge Media company builds content and communication strategies for business, philanthropy, and government clients, including the Waverly Street Foundation, Gatherverse, and a podcast called 100 Days of Kamala. Many of us wanted 1,361 more days of Kamala in the Oval Office. To kick off the discussion, Priya, what was your first impression of Paul's book?
Wow, I didn't know I was going to get to answer a question. Thank you, Virginia. That. I know, it's a little disarming.
I actually feel like I should be interviewing you, Priya.
Well, we'll start with at least one question.
Okay.
All right. Hi, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I actually really appreciate that question, Virginia, because over the course of my career, I've interviewed a lot of authors about a lot of different topics, and I skim every book. Do I read carefully every word? That has not always happened. And Paul's book, it's the galleys, apparently. I learned it's not the final, so I'm going to have to get another copy. But Paul's book, I started out with that intention of like, okay, let's see what this is about. And, I'll get the overview and then we'll come in. And I found myself reading so closely because the way this book is written, Paul did not throw himself a parade to say, look at all of the amazing work we've done in fair trade over the last 26 years of having started this. He went through it and said, he starts out with a story of failure, of trying to make a deal work with Starbucks, and it doesn't work. And he explains why and what happened. And through the book, that's what I found over and over again. I hope you pick it up and I hope you read it because it's very compelling. And it is about kind of the trials and tribulations of this work over the last many decades of him really trying to push forward an idea of better benefit for workers, for the producers of our work, and trying to bring that knowledge to light to consumers, and the ways in which he's made inroads and the ways in which he has not, and places where he thought things were going swimmingly and everything was going to work out beautifully, and then the rug got yanked out from under him. So it's a very real book, and he is not afraid to name names. I mean, we were talking about Pete's and Starbucks and Chobani and Levi's and like who does and who doesn't actually put the money in, put the work in. And I found it to be a fascinating book, and I did read every word and really enjoyed it. So I think you did an incredible job here with this, Paul.
Thanks, Priya.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the stories of the failures are much more interesting than the stories of the successes, right?
Well, it's interesting. In the intro, there's this number, 11 billion. What was it in market value that has come in
Last year.
through
Yep.
fair trade. So it sounds amazing. It sounds like, wow, look at all this work that has been accomplished. How would you characterize it? If you look at like the 26 years that you've been doing this, how would you characterize success, failure? What do you think of those numbers of the metrics that you use?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for coming out, y'all. I think between my family members and my former classmates, that's half
My
the
friend.
audience. So for those of you who didn't have to come out, thank you for coming. Look, we live in a world where 2 billion people are trying to survive on $2 a day. And fair trade is trying to tackle that. Fair trade is trying to make sure that farmers and workers around the world, the people that work so hard to grow our coffee and harvest our bananas and sew our clothes, have a decent living and can stay home and keep their kids in school. And so in consideration of the size of the problem, the fact that fair trade is working with 1.6 million families in 70 countries, and generating a market that's worth $11 billion a year. I mean, that sounds like scale, but that's not scale. And so that's what I dream about all the time, is how do we take this really beautiful model of conscious capitalism and conscious consumerism and make it much more relevant relative to the size of the problem.
Let's take people back to how you got involved in this and how you got started. And there is a little bit that's not in the book that I'm curious about, and that is was this part of your family ethos growing up? Did you come up in a world in which people, knew to care about the farmers who grew their food?
Well, my big sisters are on the front row. We can ask them.
Did you make this happen?
They definitely had a hand in it, of course. We were raised by a single mom who had grown up during the Great Depression. My grandfather picked cotton in Oklahoma during the Great Depression. And I remember hearing stories about how hard life was on the farm when I was growing up, and what it was like to go to bed hungry. And so I've always felt a sense of sympathy and empathy for farming folk. And our mom was, a bright light in her values, her progressive values. I remember going to a demonstration, a women's lib demonstration with her in Austin in 1968, and watching horrified as she burned her bra in public. And
my kids would be horrified if I did that now.
and she was a big fan of Martin Luther King, and she was an unusual Southern lady, and she had amazing values, and I absorbed them. And then when I went to college and started reading about global poverty and agricultural development, I started to see that as potentially my path to go overseas and work with farmers. And so that's what I did. And in the summer of 1983, fresh out of college, I bought a one-way ticket to Nicaragua, and I went off to work with farmers.
For 11 years.
For 11 years.
I mean, you committed. You stayed.
Well, when I went, I didn't have a vision of how long it would be, but I started working with farmers way up in the mountains in very remote rural communities, had to ride horses or dirt bikes to get up to many of these communities. These were farmers that were off the grid. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have vehicles. They were subsistence farmers largely. Some of them were growing coffee for the global market, but they didn't have direct market access. They were selling to local middlemen, and kind of locked into a generational cycle of poverty because they didn't have access to the market and didn't know how to tap into that. And so it was amazing work. I was there in the 80s, so that was during the Contra War, when there was a lot of fighting going on and a lot of folks were killed. And so it was, it definitely felt like a heroic time to be there.
You were held at gunpoint yourself at one point.
was.
Yeah. So how did that
But that's a
time
story for
start
another book.
translate into the work that you began to do? How did you step into the work of fair trade, of advocating for worker rights?
So I worked for a number of years on various international aid-funded projects, very typical of global aid, well-intentioned projects, lots of money, well-intentioned people, around the world sending us this funding, and a lot of the focus was on helping farmers improve their yields. So the approach to improving livelihoods was essentially, let's teach farmers how to, go from 1 ton of coffee to 2 tons of coffee on an acre of land, and by virtue of those higher yields, they will improve their livelihoods. So kind of ignoring the market, not really addressing the issue of, it's meaningful where you sell your product, whether it's 1 ton or 2 tons. If you sell it in the local market for a terrible price, you may not improve your living standards. So, after a number of years of working on projects like that, I began to feel kind of discouraged and disappointed with that approach. And then in the summer of 1990, I heard about fair trade for the first time. And the fair traders had a slogan: "Trade, not aid." Trade, not aid. And in the book, I talk about trade, not aid, but then I later kind of revised my position to trade and aid. And I think we've all read some of the horror stories of people around the world who literally will die as a result of Trump closing down USAID. So aid has its role. It is important. And what I learned was that markets could be an incredible force for good. I started the first fair trade co-op in Nicaragua that summer, in the summer of 1990, with 24 coffee farmers, very small, 1 acre farmers who are growing a couple of thousand pounds each per year. And so we pooled our coffee, we filled 1 container, we shipped it to a fair trade buyer, actually a buyer in Boston, Equal Exchange. And they paid us over $1 a pound for our coffee at a time when the local market price was 10 cents a pound. So, simple math, those farmers were growing 2,000 pounds a year times 10 cents. They would have received $200 total cash income for the year. Typically, they would grow a little bit of corn, a little bit of beans, so they were growing some of their own food, but their cash income would have been about $200 for the year, not even $1 a day. And at $1 a pound, through this fair trade buyer, we got them $2,000 that year. It was more money than anyone had seen. I was a very popular boy that summer. I became Pablo $1. That was like the mantra: join the co-op and we'll get you $1 for a pound. So I was Pablo $1 for a minute. And it was kind of revolutionary, actually. We grew very quickly to 3,000 families. I led the co-op for 4 years. We were exporting like 150 20-foot containers by the last year to fair trade buyers, mostly in Europe at that point. Fair trade started in Europe. It was 10 or 15 years ahead in Europe.
Was it subsidized?
No, not at all. It was all based on companies looking to connect more directly with producers around the world and just pay a better price. And so, the result of all that extra money coming in was extraordinary.
What happened?
We helped farmers stay on the land. what is so twisted and wrong about the current conversation in this country around immigration is the truth of the matter, which is that most people come to the United States looking for opportunity and fleeing poverty. And so to help farmers earn enough from their coffee to stay on the land was remarkable, just in and of itself. We created scholarship programs to help families keep their kids in school. Typically in Nicaragua and throughout the developing world, local schoolhouses go through 6th grade, and then middle school and high school often are in the nearby town, and that costs bus money and uniform money. And so the norm in Nicaragua at the time was kids would stay in school through 6th grade, and then they would be at age 12, they would be out in the fields. So we created scholarship programs for kids to go to high schools, $200 a year per kid. But we sent a whole generation on to high school and then on to college. We ran health programs. We dug wells and brought clean drinking water into communities for the first time. We reforested hillsides that had been deforested a generation earlier by U.S. lumber companies. We ran a micro-lending program for women entrepreneurs who wanted to develop their own economic independence. We did all of this amazing work, and thanks to no one's charity, right? Just thanks to this simple concept of a fair price for a great product. And so, of course, the most exciting thing about it wasn't just the clean water and the kids in school. It was the hope and the pride and the dignity of people writing their own story, architecting their own future.
We're going to come back to your journey out of Nicaragua to a small office in Oakland and a warehouse and on. But, when we think about sort of global forces, and you briefly mentioned Trump, our talk is called Trade Not Tariffs, right? Where do you see his actions as impacting fair trade in our world today? Where does the rub come?
Yeah. First of all, I think what's happening right now in this country with tariffs is outrageous. I mean, tariffs are going to hurt consumers. We're all going to pay more for not only imported things, but for things manufactured here in the U.S. that have imported components to them. So, I think tariffs are inflationary, and the Consumer Confidence Index report came out today. Consumer confidence in the U.S. economy is at its lowest point since before COVID. So clearly consumers are concerned about the impact on them. The business community, I talk to business people almost every day in the various retailers and brands that we work with, and they're all concerned. They're all concerned about the impact of tariffs on their businesses. Reduced demand, reduced sales, potential layoffs. And I think tariffs are really bad for sustainability. I spoke with a grower in Mexico. He runs an $80 million tomato company, and he sells to Costco and Whole Foods and Walmart and Kroger, all the major retailers. And he's fair trade certified and doing his best to produce in a sustainable and responsible way. And he is getting pushback from all of the retail buyers of his product in that they are saying they are not going to absorb the full price tag of the tariffs because they're worried about passing that on to consumers and consumers not wanting to buy tomatoes anymore. So they're basically saying to him that he has to absorb half of the tariff. Well, the margins are so slim in the tomato business that for him to be able to, he doesn't know whether he'll have a business with that extra cost, but he says right off the bat, he's going to have to start freezing some of the investments and expenses that he has been planning on. So he was going to build new worker housing not only because he feels like it's the right thing to do, but he wants to retain his labor, he wants to retain his workers, he wants to create an environment where they want to stay. And he said that's on hold indefinitely. He can't move forward with that project. So when I think about sustainability, I think about worker welfare, worker benefit. But then also he said, I was going to put solar panels on my farm and transition to renewable energy, which will reduce my cost in the long term. But he said, I can't afford to do that right now. There's just too much uncertainty. So for me, it just really crystallized how tariffs are impacting investments in sustainability across the board.
Through the book, time and again, we see that these are, it's conscious capitalism, still capitalism. People are making business decisions. And it seems like, even sans tariffs, there have been many times in which the programs have been shut down because of the finances. Chobani is one of those examples. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that. And then I do want to go back to some of the earlier parts of your story. Can you tell us a little bit about the Chobani experience of getting involved with them, what you thought it might do for dairy, and how that went?
Yeah.
So Chobani, the yogurt.
Yeah, so Chobani came to us 6 or 7 years ago and said, we love what you're doing with coffee and apparel and all these products, and we would love to explore how to bring fair trade to the dairy industry. No, we weren't working in dairy. It's a similar industry to agriculture, but obviously there's some issues specific to dairy. Worker safety. There's some particular worker safety issues. Also, animal welfare is unique to dairy, or unique to things like dairy. So we partnered with Chobani to develop a dairy module to our agricultural standard. They were very generous in funding the research and funding the piloting of a new dairy standard. They always said they wanted to scale the program up. They didn't want to be the only company doing fair trade dairy. Hamdi Ulukaya, who's the founder of Chobani and the CEO, is a visionary, and he's a values-led leader. He's deeply committed to sustainability, and he and I became friends and thought partners with each other, and I was really excited about this program, and we launched it, and they put the fair trade label on a significant assortment of their products. It was, like with most companies, when they start fair trade, they dip their toe in the water, they put a number of products out there to see if they'll sell, and then they build out the assortment based on performance. So Chobani did the same, and they were in the market for a few years. And we interviewed the farm workers on the dairy farms. Upstate New York and Idaho is where they were sourcing. And the farm workers were excited about the program. They were getting more money through the fair trade premium. Perhaps I should explain that.
We're going to get there. We'll go back to it.
Fair trade buyers pay a premium, right? And it's managed by the farmers and the workers on these farms, and they invest it in needs that they identify. And so it's a powerful way to, essentially engage and enable the community to invest in its own needs. So from our perspective, the dairy program was a success. But we were not able to recruit other companies to the cause. So Chobani, for 2 or 3 years, remained the only brand selling fair trade yogurt in their case. We approached Whole Foods. We approached a lot of the different organic dairy companies because we thought that would be kind of a natural alignment. Like Stonyfield Farms and so on. And this all coincided with COVID and a lot of supply chain disruption. It coincided with milk commodity prices plummeting. And so the fair trade, the gap between the open market price of milk and the fair trade premium was more significant. And for whatever reason, we weren't able to recruit other companies, and Chobani, for its part, felt like fair trade was not helping them gain new retail accounts. So they didn't really see the value on the consumer side. And, at the end of the day, all of the companies that work with us have kind of a mix of motivations. Some are doing it because they're led by values-driven leaders, and they just believe it's the right thing to do, and they're going to make it work no matter what. Other companies are doing it because they want to mitigate reputational risk of, a child labor scandal in their supply chain. So it's a very kind of reputation-focused motivation. Others want to get involved in fair trade to strengthen their supply chain. Consumer engagement, brand differentiation, that's a major reason why many brands come to us. It was definitely a motivator for Chobani, and they didn't see the ROI. So I got the call a couple of years ago. Hamdi called me up personally, and he said, "I've got bad news for you, brother. We're going to pull out. It's not working." And, obviously it was a heartbreaking call. But it, to me, it points to kind of this messy, experimental phase of capitalism that we're in, a 50-year phase, not a 5-year phase, a 50-year phase, where we're all trying to crack the code on how to make business responsible and sustainable and profitable, right? We're all trying to overcome this trade-off mentality that business people have had in the past of either they could maximize profits or they could be sustainable, but they couldn't do both. And that inherently there was a trade-off there. And I think what is happening is more and more business leaders are finding ways to use sustainability as a way to make the company more successful, right? But there's no one blueprint. There's no roadmap that fits everyone. Every company has their own calculus of factors that they want to consider when they do things like fair trade or other expressions of ethical sourcing. And so, it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because we've had great successes and then we've had spectacular failures. And it's my hope that business people reading this book will find insights on how they can engineer their businesses with greater sustainability and with ethical sourcing kind of at the core, and to do that, based on a solid business case, not just because of values.
Well, let's get into the mechanics of how it actually works. How does your model of fair trade work? Can you talk about the impact fees that are associated with that and how that's been working for you?
So fair trade is a standard. I mean, it's a movement. It's a community, but it's also a standard. And we're probably all familiar with organics, and there's an organic standard, and farms that want to be certified organic get audited every year, and they either pass or they don't pass. So fair trade is similar. It's a 200-point checklist of social, environmental, and labor criteria. And when a farm or a factory meet those criteria, they get audited. And if they pass their audit, then they're certified for a year. They can wear that Fair Trade Certified label on their product. And on this side of the market, our now roughly 2,000 market partners, everyone from Patagonia to PepsiCo to Nespresso, Walmart, Whole Foods, they agree to pay a premium. And the premium is small. I mean, in the case of apparel, it's 1% of the factory gate price. In the case of fresh produce, it's 2 cents per pound. Seemingly small amounts of money, but multiplied by millions of pounds of product means that, last year alone, we channeled $100 million in impact premiums back to communities around the world. And we don't get to tell the farmers or the workers how to spend that money, nor does the brand. The farmers or the workers get to decide themselves. So they elect a fair trade committee That committee conducts what we call a needs assessment, essentially a survey of the entire community to find out what are our priorities this year. Is it health? Is it education? Is it housing or clean water or some other investment? And then they rank those and deploy, however much money, a couple of $100,000 a year in the case of many groups. And so they're selecting this much for this project and that much for another. And I just came back from the specialty coffee trade show, and I was talking with the Colombian growers that work with Nespresso. And Nespresso last year sent over $2 million to these communities in southern Colombia, and they spent the money on clean water. 65,000 households. They all have, I think 97% have tap water installed in their homes. So they don't have to go outside to pump a well. They have the tap water. But almost 100% of the households tested, we found that the water was contaminated. So they had water, but it was dirty water. And a lot of it came from the mountainside. There was cattle grazing on the mountainside, so water was contaminated. So what they needed was not water systems, but water filtration. And so they deployed their Fairtrade Premium to install village-level water filtration systems, super low-tech, locally available materials, and they were able to clean up the water supply. And, we kind of take for granted, unless you live in Flint, Michigan, in most communities in the U.S. take for granted that when you open the tap and drink the water, you won't get sick. But for these communities in southern Colombia, this was a big deal. And obviously, when you clean up the water, it means the health indicators jump dramatically. So, the premium is kind of the hallmark of the fair trade model. There are other certifications where there might be extra money sent back to communities, but usually those are projects that are selected by the brand. And they act kind of like a donor. And so one of the things I love about fair trade is that it's the community who knows their own needs best, who are deciding each year how to spend those premiums.
And then just to stay a bit technical for a minute, you're thinking about those premiums now and what works. If it's a flat premium, it's how it has been for a long time. If you're going to be more dynamic in those premiums, tell us a little bit about how that sort of plan with these impact premiums has encountered the marketplace and how you're responding.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that. My sad lament at the beginning of this conversation about how small fair trade is in the pale of global poverty, that reflection, why is fair trade still only 6% of the U.S. coffee market and 1% of the U.S. chocolate market? Like, why is it still small after all these years? And part of the answer, we believe, is that it has been relatively too expensive to scale. And we've heard that feedback from brands and retailers who say, if you right-size your premiums, we could do dramatically much more volume and help a lot more people. So we've begun experimenting with that hypothesis that, the premiums might be too high to scale. So, for example, in the case of fresh produce, our premiums range from 4 cents a pound to 9 cents a pound. So it was high and it was complex. And so we experimented a couple of years ago with lowering the premiums to 2 cents a pound across the board to see what would happen. And as a result of lowering the premium, we have been able to triple the total number of dollars going back to families. This last year, fair trade produce grew by 35%. The category is on fire. It used to just be Whole Foods and Costco. Now Walmart and Kroger and Safeway and other retailers are getting involved. And so, it's kind of simple math. If the premium is too high to scale and therefore the volume is low, the end result is, from our experience, less money going back to communities than a more modest premium, but then dramatically more volume. So, the reputational risk in that kind of experiment was, would we be accused of selling out the farmers that we profess to serve, right? Like, even internally, we had staff members saying, what the hell? Like, why are we lowering premiums? Aren't we here to get more money back to poor people? And the answer is, yeah. And it's simple math, volume times premium. So, we've experimented with produce and had great results. We've experimented with factory, and our factory program also grew 28% last year. So it seems to be working. This more right-sized premium as a way of unleashing dramatic volume.
Just to kind of finish your story, you came back from Nicaragua. You started in an office in Oakland, and then what?
You missed a really important step.
Oh,
I went to UC Berkeley and got an MBA.
Yeah.
Berkeley in the house. Raise your hand.
There you go. That's right.
Got my fans. So, I moved back from there. I'd been in Nicaragua for 11 years at that point. I became
married, had kids.
Married in a local gal, had kids, was rocking the the mustache and barely spoke English. I felt like I needed the toolbox of the MBA program, and Berkeley Haas was the best place for me and what I wanted to do. And so I actually wrote the business plan for Fairtrade USA in my entrepreneurship class at Berkeley, and met a lot of great people in the program who I ended up doing business with later on, or hired later on. So that was amazing. So I ended up, launching Fairtrade USA a couple of years after that in '98.
Mm-hmm. I want to give you an opportunity to tell a really great story. When you think about, the last many years that you've been doing this, what stands out to you is like, man, that's such a success. I'm so happy that this happened.
The last time I was in Baja California visiting Driscoll's Strawberries, I met with some farm workers there who told the story of, how they had been profoundly at odds with Driscoll's a number of years before over wages and conditions, and many of them had chosen to strike, and there was even a boycott here in the U.S., and it was in that context that Driscoll's came to us and said, we need help. And we thought about it long and hard, because we didn't want to be used for greenwashing. Mm-hmm. We didn't want to work with a company that we didn't feel was sincere in their intent. But after a number of conversations with both Driscoll's and with the striking unions and leaders of the boycott, we decided to run at the problem, not to run away from it. We decided that we wanted to work with Driscoll's to overcome the labor strife, repair the problems, and do better. That was what they said they wanted to do, and we took them at their word. And so we worked with them to develop a program that today covers all of their farms in Baja California, which is about, 15% of Driscoll's total global production. And it's obviously a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And they really went deep. They really embraced the ethos of worker engagement, of not only improving wages and conditions and benefits, but of really engaging the workforce. And the Fair Trade Committee and the way Fair Trade premiums are managed gave them a way to talk to the workers in a way that wasn't confrontational, to gather feedback about how they could do better, about supervisors that weren't showing up well. And so for Driscoll's, it was a success story because they were able to get past this hard moment in their history and live the values that they wanted to live and to be the company that they dreamed of being. It's family owned. And for the farm workers, they went from basically being at war with their employer to being in a collaborative relationship where they were able to problem solve collaboratively, and then they were getting the fair trade premium. And this one gentleman that I was talking to, Benito, was talking about all the things that the fair trade premium, that they had used the fair trade premium for. He talked about water. Water is very scarce drinking water is scarce in the Baja Peninsula. So they invested in water systems and water tanks so that families could collect water. They also funded what they call Feria de Salud, which is health fairs. So they're not local clinics. Hospitals are far away. And so they funded every quarter a health fair where in their community, doctors and other health care specialists would come and offer treatment, and both preventative treatment and care for the community. And he talked about how his wife had basically I don't know the details of it, but the way he described it was she was able to access tests and get a diagnosis for a problem and then get treatment that was life-saving. And he talked about how these fairs had saved her life. And that story and hundreds more like it reflect the essence of fair trade, which is not just bringing water and healthcare and benefits to hardworking farm workers, but doing that in a way that's good for business, right? And overcoming, again, this notion that it's either business or it's workers, but it's not both. Or it's profits or it's sustainability, but it's not both. And for me, that's the challenge for our generation, is to figure out how to harness business, how to create a business case for sustainability and regeneration before it's too late.
I'm going to ask one last question then. The book is called Every Purchase Matters. So for those of us sitting here listening to this, is that what it takes, you think, for consumers to go out and look for the fair trade label and say, yes, I'm voting with my dollars. This is the way I want it to go, and we're going to see the floodgates open? What needs to happen? What do we need to do as consumers to make a difference here?
I believe the power is in our hands. We hear on the news about the powerful people in politics and the billionaires and what they're doing. And, I reckon many of us are outraged by that, and many of us feel powerless. Hard to know what to do. And I think many people are just kind of hunkered down and thinking, they'll vote for change 4 years from now. But the reality is we don't have to wait 4 years to vote for change. We can vote for change tomorrow when we go to the grocery store. Simply by choosing products that are sustainable, that have social or environmental attributes, whether it's fair trade or organic or any number of expressions of sustainable products and sustainable business, that's a chance for us to leverage our purchasing dollars to support change. And companies are listening. Companies are really, really dialed into consumer preferences. And if we reward companies that are moving in that direction, they'll do more and more will follow. And I've definitely seen that in this 26-year journey of fair trade, where companies came in, when we started apparel, Prana and Patagonia were, the first two brands, and it took off. And then J. Crew followed, and then Gap, and Williams-Sonoma jumped in and started doing fair trade furniture, and Elf Beauty now doing fair trade cosmetics. So, there is a competitive dynamic in the sustainability, in the sustainable business. But it doesn't work unless consumers buy the product, right? And so I think American consumers are are sleeping giants. You know, we have so much power to affect change, but we're kind of asleep. We don't always realize how powerful we are.
Okay, I want to read just a quick line, and then I'm going to let Virginia in here. So, you know, it is a tough time out there, and at the end of your book, you talk about kind of the daily news and the dire situation that we see out there. And you say, it doesn't depress me. It feels like both a call to action and a reminder that social change is a long-term struggle. What we've accomplished thus far gives me a sense of hope and optimism about the future. I don't mean to sound naive. Obviously, humanity still confronts an enormous number of complex problems. Tackling these issues gets me out of bed in the morning. The evolution I see is squiggly, not straight, punctuated, not continuous. It's frustratingly slow and full of setbacks, but it's progress nonetheless. The fact that much of the progress we've made has been achieved collectively as a human family makes me hopeful. Our track record to date gives me confidence that we can successfully tackle what we're facing today and will face in the future. And I really appreciated that, especially at a time where it does feel very hard when we look at the outside world. Yeah. So I appreciated that note of encouragement and that bigger picture of what has changed in our society and in our world over the last 100 years. So thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Paul and Priya. I'd also like to thank our audience for your thoughtful questions and for joining us. You're welcome to linger and get a signed copy of Paul's book. And now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California in its 123rd year of enlightened discussion is adjourned. Thank you so much.